According to one tradition, Shamshi-Adad was the son of Ila-Kabkabu, the first known king of Ekalatum, a city located just to the north of Ashur that was established by Amorites. Unlike Ashur itself, Ekalatum's conflict with Mari was undeniably hot, a situation that both Shamshi-Adad and the king of Mari, Lagilitum, had inherited from their fathers. Upon ascending to the throne in around 1810 BC, Shamshi-Adad attempted to extend his rule into the valley along the Kabul River, but was defeated by Yagid-Lim, the king of Mari. After a further series of skirmishes involving another Assyrian ruler, Naram-Sin, the king of Ashur, Shamshi-Adad fled south along the river, finding refuge at another of the rising powers founded by fellow Amorites, the city of Babylon. After a number of years serving the Amorites of Babylon as a mercenary commander, potentially gaining vital military experience, Shamshi-Adad moved back up the Tigris to reclaim Ekalatum, an outpost that stood just north of Ashur and may have served as a sort of military outpost to the city. He stayed there for 3 years, either having seized the settlement or in service to the ruling dynasty of Ashur, either under Naram-Sin or his successor. Upon the arrival of the armies of Eshnunna, however, Shamshi-Adad bursts into history like a raging lion, defeating the invaders and using the success to set himself up as the new king of the city. Almost immediately, he began an ambitious plan of expansion, apparently wishing no less than to build an empire to rival that of the ever-growing power of Larsa to the south, now under the control of an Amorite warlord named Rin-Sin. Before setting out on his first set of conquests, Shamshi-Adad put his son Ishmi-Dagan in charge of Ekalatum. Then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he set out on the first of innumerable Assyrian military campaigns in history. To begin with, Shamshi-Adad seems to have set about seizing all of the northern lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, unifying the Amorite tribes there and no doubt enlisting many of the previously hostile warlords into his armies. Next on the agenda, and much to the horror of the sophisticated and relatively unwarlike dynasty that ruled there, he marched on the other great power of northern Mesopotamia, Mari, executing its king Yadud-Lim and installing another of his own sons, Yazma-Adad, to rule over the city in his stead. Unwilling to leave any potential rivals to his power, Shamshi-Adad's purge of the elites in Mari was swift and brutal, seeing nearly every relative of Yadun-Lim executed. Just one royal prince managed to escape the bloodbath, having married a daughter of the king of neighbouring Yamad, based at the city of Aleppo. His name was Zimri-Lim, and eventually he would return to his native city, though not until long after Shamshi-Adad's death. Shamshi-Adad, meanwhile, now showing all of the future Assyrian traits of modesty by calling himself Master of the Universe, carried on his conquests, seizing lands as far east of the Tigris as the Zagros Mountains, territories still held by the rugged Gutian nomads on behalf of Elamite overlords to their south. According to inscriptions and cuneiform tablets excavated all over northern Mesopotamia, Shamshi-Adad was a master of siege warfare, possessing all of the latest military techniques of the age, and a large elite army to enforce his will upon those unfortunate enough to come up against him. To the north, he conquered the cities of Arbela and Nineveh, establishing, arguably for the first time, a firm northern triangle between the upper Tigris and the lower Zab rivers, cornered by the 3 major cities of the Assyrian kingdom, Ashur, Arbela, and Nineveh, unifying the area under a single dynasty, a dynasty known to us today as the Old Assyrian Empire, despite the fact that he, like the other warlords now holding sway in Old Sumeria, was in fact an Amorite outsider. The archaeological evidence of Shamshi-Adad's reign is staggering. He built intricate temples all over his lands, over a vast geographical distance. According to his inscriptions, rather than impose taxes and tributary status to existing elites, he installed his own governors and garrisons everywhere he went, die-hard followers who were personally loyal to him. The evidence suggests that aside from being a gifted military commander, Shamshi-Adad distinguished himself by being an exceptionally capable administrator and propagandist, effectively portraying himself as an Assyrian, even altering the Assyrian king list to legitimize himself. He kept firm controls on all matters of state, ranging from high policy down to the appointment of individual officials, and the dispatching of provisions and supplies. Extraordinarily detailed records and dispatches have been excavated from his reign, providing us with unparalleled glimpses into his personal dealings. Perhaps most notably, he remained perpetually disappointed with the performance of one of his sons, Shamshi-Adad, ruling on his behalf in the conquered city of Mari. One of the cuneiform letters in question reads, "Are you a child, not a man? Have you no beard on your chin?" And another in regards to Shamshi-Adad's brother Ishmi-Dagan, ruling up in Ekalatum, reads, "While here your brother is victorious, down there you lie about among the women." In addition to pure military might, spies and propaganda were often used to win over rival cities. Though unlike the much later Neo-Assyrian Empire, Shamshi-Adad did allow conquered territories to maintain some of their earlier practices. Usually the main changes to occur would be at the very top of the society in question, though in some cases, such as Qatar, the local rulers of the city maintained authority, but became vassals when they were incorporated into his kingdom. This was perhaps one of the main causes of his success, and subsequent rapid downfall of the empire after his own death. Shamshi-Adad's architectural achievements were impressive, evident in ruins from the Tigris to the Zagros Mountains. In Nineveh, he used state resources to rebuild the Ishtar temple, and in Ashur, he poured money into magnificent structures. His crowning achievement, however, was his capital city. Rather than utilize one of the already existing settlements between the two rivers, true to his ambitious and wide-reaching tendencies, he opted to create his own. Fairly early in his reign, Shamshi-Adad took over the long-abandoned town of Shekna, today known as Tel Leilan, seeing the great potential in the rich agricultural production of the region, renaming it Subat Enlil, meaning the residence of the god Enlil in the Akkadian language, still spoken throughout his realm. He decided to convert it into his personal residence and capital city, perhaps viewing himself as the founder of a great empire to rival his predecessor Sargon of Akkad. Utilising the best craftsmen from all over his lands, a royal palace was ordered to be built, and a temple acropolis, to which a straight paved road led from the city gate. There was also a planned residential area, and the entire city was enclosed by a cyclopean wall. The size of the city was around 220 acres, and at its peak, it may have housed a population of around 20,000 people. Yet, Despite all of Shamshi-Adad's protests to the contrary, there were still other major players to rival his power. To the east, over the Zagros Mountains, the kings of Elam were always a threat, and now increasingly sought to try their mettle against northern Mesopotamia, as well as southern. Closer to home still, the ever-present kings of Eshnunna, survivors from the Sumerian past, also had to be dealt with, usually through diplomatic means. Back in the south, meanwhile, Rin-Sin of Larsa finally succeeded in conquering Isin, thus ending a war that had lasted for 200 years, and definitively establishing his city as not only the strongest power of the south, but the successor to the cultural legacy of the Sumerian world. Though in reality, he had just stamped out the last Sumerian state to really call itself that with any authenticity. The old gods survived, and the Sumerian language for a while, mostly for religious ceremonies, but by and large, besides being an ideal to look back upon and aspire to, the old days of Sumeria were in the past. A new world had dawned, and increasingly it would orient itself towards the north. By around 1794 BC, in a near unprecedented achievement, just two men held nearly all of the Mesopotamian plain between them, Rin-Sin being master of the south and Shamshi-Adad master of the north. The only other independent state that survived between the two rivers, by reason of its geography, was Babylon, that same Amorite city where Shamshi-Adad had spent some of his youth. The city was simply too far to the south to be seen as an issue for Shamshi-Adad, and too far to the north to be an issue for Rin-Sin. Shamshi-Adad may have even been a distant relative to the kings of Babylon, the 12 kings who live in tents, cited on both the Babylonian king list and the Assyrian king list, both bearing the same names. Whether this is true or not, the two men certainly allied with each other, with Shamshi-Adad, of course, being acknowledged as the more important of the two, and Babylon's young king tributary to him. Two years later, however, Shamshi-Adad was dead, and within just a handful of generations, so was his empire. That young king had learned a thing or two from his mentor, and in time, his power would grow to such an extent that he would eventually eclipse the great Assyrian ruler himself. His name was Hammurabi. It didn't take long for Shamshi-Adad's empire to unravel when news of his death reached the various cities and provinces. In regards to his son, Yasma-Adad, it appears that his concerns proved all too real, with Mari declaring its independence once more almost immediately. Ishmi-Dagan managed to keep hold of Ekalatum, though he was unable to restore power to the city despite his many attempts, and was himself now the repeated target of nearby powers. In particular, Zimri-Lim, the exiled and vengeful prince of Mari, who had returned from Yamad to reclaim his birthright following Shamshi-Adad's death. It was the Elamites who finally conquered Ekalatum in 1765, forcing Ishmi-Dagan to flee south to the court of his traditional ally, Hammurabi of Babylon. Hammurabi, in turn, helped him to reclaim his throne, but at a cost, of course. Ekalatum and Ashur subsequently became vassals, subservient to the kings of Babylon, who, over the coming decades, came to control all of Mesopotamia, unifying almost all of Shamshi-Adad's and Rin-Sin's kingdoms into a unified whole.